I learned so much. I sort of really threw myself into the history of which London, some of these routes were routes that were, put on the map by monks, and, wonderful kind of religious history and battles. In that early period, Ed, I found so many of them in or very close to London.
Hello, and welcome to Series 1, Episode 3 of Outlandish. I'm your host, Ed Scott, and I'm delighted to be joined this week by a true legend of the London ultra-running scene, DaznBone. One half of the ultra-coaching power couple turned race-directing duo DaznBone, David has spent the last few years working alongside his business partner Darren Strachan to put together Camino Ultra, a one-of-a-kind event company organising ultramarathon races right in the beating heart of the UK's great metropolis, London. Camino have quickly risen through the ranks to become one of those must-race organisations, thanks to their focus on friendly, inclusive races that celebrate the back of the pack just as much as the front runners, and which showcase some of London's many hidden green spaces. Just like Camino's events, David himself is incredibly warm and friendly, but he's definitely no pushover, having completed a number of truly epic ultramarathons himself, including that most hallowed of events, the Spartathlon, a 153-mile or 246-kilometre road race from Athens to Sparta, based on the original legendary run of Pheidippides before the Battle of Marathon, from which we get the name of the modern marathon race. I wanted to talk to David about our shared passion for London's unsung greenery. Whilst there are no windswept mountaintops or barren moors to gaze out upon in this city, there's more to running in London than endless loops of your local park, and when it comes to trail running, nobody is more of a champion for our capital's green spaces than David. This podcast was recorded remotely in May 2022. Just a word of warning, we did experience some technical issues during the recording process, largely attributable to my terrible Wi-Fi. I've done my best to edit over the gaps, but the first half of this conversation was, in true London fashion, affected by severe delays. As always, do stick around to the end of the episode where there is a preview of next week's episode and a bonus clip from this talk. And now, DaznBone. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
It's such a pleasure to have you on. I want to take our listeners back a couple of years. I lived overseas from the end of 2018 until literally a couple of days before the first lockdown in 2020. And one of the many things that really struck me in those first couple of months being back was that suddenly everywhere I looked on the London trail running scene, there was Camino Ultra everywhere. So I'd love you to sort of walk our listeners through the story of Camino. And I think a really good place to start would just be sort of with your co-director and your fellow ultra running coach, Darren Strachan. So how did the two of you first meet?
So many things are kind of intertwined with Daz, Mr. Strachan. We actually met in a work capacity, Ed. So over 25 years ago, I was working for a company called Diageo, sort of a large drinks company here in London, and Darren was working for a small IT development company. And his company came on board to do a project with us, and we sat next to each other and we bonded over a love of the white stripes and the strokes, which was obviously a very big thing at the time, and not so much running actually, Ed, in those early days, but we became very close friends. Actually, our running really kind of took off when we started to do some fundraising for a really close friend of ours, whose daughter has a condition called hemiplegia, which is where at birth you kind of have like stroke-like effects either on the left or the right-hand side of your body, and it can be either mild or kind of very severe if it's sort of brain affected. and we started an association with the charity that was supporting people with hemiplegia. And I don't know if you remember, Ed, but back in the day, when people first started, charity fundraising, you had to raise quite a lot of money to do like the big city marathons. It's somewhere like £1,500 or £2,000 fee, before you started making some good impact with the charity. So it was really at the point where we'd done a few like Brighton Marathon, London Marathon, Manchester Marathon with the charity, and we realised we needed to do something else to kind of capture people's imagination and try and set some big fundraising targets. And so the charity said to us, oh, well, we can get you London Marathon places and Brighton Marathon places, and they're 1 week apart. Why don't you do both marathons? And then our friend Jamie suggested, well, if we're going to do that, how about in the middle of the week, we get the train down to Brighton and we run from Brighton to London.
Wow.
Effectively doing kind of 4 marathons in 8 days. And, and that's for your listeners, there's some wonderful kind of history about the running of London to Brighton. It is kind of recognised as one of the kind of oldest recognised ultra marathon running routes, throughout history. And so I think something kind of unlocked itself for myself and Darren in doing that specific run that day, that Brighton to London. We were really kind of taken by the enormity of it. It wasn't our finest moment. It did take all day. We did eat some truly atrocious non-nutritional food. All of the things that we've kind of learned over the years to be better at. We got it all wrong on that day, but it certainly did capture people's imaginations. We raised a lot of money, and future years after that, we were then looking for something else, and so after doing a 60 miler, we did the Cotswolds 100 miler as a challenge, and then we did a 24-hour non-stop run together. And it was around that time, Ed, that we started to learn a bit more about a race called the Spartathlon, which became a huge thing from both myself and Darren, both the complexity of trying to get into that race via the ballot process, and then having our name in the ballot, and we didn't get in for the first couple of years. And it was sort of around that time in 2015, 2016, when the sort of seed of Camino first, and all of those many miles and hours of training runs, Ed, we just started to sort of formulate some ideas initially around coaching, about kind of sharing with other people that, how you move into ultra marathons and how you look at perhaps doing something with, more endurance and kind of more complexity to some of the simple racing. And after a couple of years of coaching, we realized that, a lot of the people we were coaching were doing some quite hefty travel in order to do ultra marathons. There was quite a heavy footprint, as we all know, Ed. People sort of flying or heading off to Scotland and Wales. So we just thought, well, hang on, there's a lot of people in London. We've been doing a lot of these FKT routes where we first met, Ed. And we just decided to, start with our own 50k ultra marathons.
Well, you've got quite a full calendar of events now. For people who don't know, you've got the Lee Valley 50 kilometres, which is in June, which runs from Welwyn Garden City to Hackney. You've also got the Epping Forest 50 kilometres, which is in October. They have a really unique quality to them in that you're not asking people, as you said, you're not asking them to travel far to head out into the hills or into the countryside. You're kind of celebrating the green spaces that are in or very close to London itself. Is that quite important to you, that your events are sort of London-centric?
Yeah, it's absolutely huge for us. I think, one of the most kind of core values to us is that, we're very much the sort of family centric pair of boys, myself and Daz, and we sort of want to carry that life balance element into it. So, it's the sort of least obtrusive way of putting on events and getting families involved when we can kind of do them in our own backyard. Plus also the sort of celebration of the kind of the quality edge of the terrain that we do have on our doorstep. I think, again, you see it, a lot of it on social media, this idea that you need to leave London or the big cities in order to find green space and trails, and especially through the kind of the Greenways challenge, we've sought to challenge that itself, and I think once you start to get an idea of the kind of waymarked trails and paths there are in London, you can actually do those in short versions, and then start to build up a picture of how you could kind of join them together to make kind of slightly longer versions. I was chatting, Ed, to a mutual friend, Danny Easton, who does other podcasts, and he was prophesizing that it was a sort of a gateway drug. You kind of get people on kind of 5k 10k trails, and before they know it, they'd be doing the London Loop.
There's this kind of balancing act that event directors have to walk between, on the one hand, making an event challenging, which is important to some people, but on the other hand, kind of making it fun and accessible. Where do you kind of see Camino's events sort of on that spectrum?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. As someone who very much loves the full spectrum of the ultra marathon world, Camino is definitely the entry point ultra marathon race companies. So, we're targeting ourselves at people who are perhaps much more comfortable and familiar with 10k half marathons up to marathons, and are curious about maybe repositioning their relationship with running. Ed, you're probably very familiar with the phrase, when someone completes a marathon, somebody will ask, well, what was your time?
Yeah.
And when someone completes an ultra marathon, they go, oh, great, did you finish?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a very much, it's a different mindset, which we absolutely cherish. So yeah, all of our ultra marathons are 50 kilometers in length, and we believe a sort of very generous cut-off for each of the events. So it's 9 hours, Ed. So although we're not specifically targeting ourselves at walkers, it is very possible to complete any of our events with a sort of healthy run-walk strategy in terms of the day.
You've got two other events that are really quite different. Can you sort of talk us through, first of all, the Centre of the Universe race? Well, how does that work? What's the premise for that?
Yeah, exactly. So, as you know well, Ed, that period that we all went through with the pandemic, really threw up a lot of challenges for myself and for Darren when we were looking at what Camino could do in that space. And so we'd been working for quite some time with our friend Chris Mills, who's got a company called Race Director, and they were starting to use trackers much more in bigger ultra marathons. So this is the ability to kind of fix a tracker to your race vest or your backpack, turn it on, and then the race director can, keep a close eye on where that person is, where they're traveling to, and there's like an emergency feature on there, if someone kind of gets lost or in distress. So yeah, for ourselves, Ed, we were thinking, okay, well, this is an idea. One of the big challenges for running itself in the pandemic were the rules around how many people could actually be together.
Yeah.
So we thought, okay, well, let's have this idea where we've got this 50k distance, but we actually set people off to start the event in unique places, and then they all head towards us. So we kind of had this this idea of using some technology to kind of map out a sort of a radius outside of London, and then we put inside of the rules that anybody that signed up had to look for a sort of starting point that was outside of that radius. Mm-hmm. And we'd kind of worked out that pretty much any sort of trail route from outside of that radius to the finish, which is where we're based in Hackney in East London, would be kind of 50k there or thereabouts.
Right.
So we've had people sort of starting in Kent along the Thames, out in Essex, in Romford, Dagenham, and all the way around basically the outside the M25, and finding their own unique ways to kind of head into London. And when we did it the first time, Ed, also because again, we're talking about people taking on their first ever ultramarathon. Yeah. We had some people finishing in 3.5 hours, and some people finishing in 9 hours. So again, the first year we hosted that race, we had we were able to manage all of the entrants so that they were finishing at different times, and therefore there wasn't a big congregation of concern around the kind of the pandemic ruling. Now that all that's gone, we've been able to kind of look for more interesting ways to create this as a team version. So we've had in this year, we had a lot more people that signed up to do it, a bunch of friends, who might live in Surrey or Hertfordshire, meeting up the night before and then all starting together at 8 a.m, heading into London.
Amazing. Is there a sort of trend of where people choose to start? I guess starting somewhere in Essex would make sense, right? Because it's kind of quite flat. And I guess you avoid having to run through all of London if you come that way into Hackney.
I think it's been the real fascinating thing, both about the event and the kind of the explosion of trail running, I would say, Ed. There's a lot more curiosity out there in terms of what you and I might recognise as being a kind of more traditional route. So, that like the Lee Valley, as you've mentioned already, goes from Welling to Hertford, and then it comes round and it pretty much follows the Lee Valley Canal, in a very easy to follow route all the way back into to London. Yeah. But actually, when you get the maps out, you'll realise that there's a couple of other less well known trail routes that sort of follow a similar part of London. But there's one called the Stour Path.
Mm-hmm. That's sort of south, like I said, into Kent, right?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. So we've had people that have come up with stuff that we didn't even know about, which is fantastic. And then when people see where other people have chosen to run, it obviously puts a seed in their mind as to something that they might go off and check out for themselves at a later date.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're speaking my language. A provisional title for this podcast when I was coming up with it was edgelanders, because I'm just super passionate about those quote unquote edgeland terrains, those places where the city and the country kind of merge together. The Stour Valley Path is a great example of that, particularly as you're coming in towards the river. It's another world. We
recently been doing another route called the Roding Valley, Ed, and it's a river that in some areas has disappeared, but it effectively kind of goes on the east side of London, north to south, and it actually sort of goes into the River Thames. And one of the things that I absolutely cherish about it is that for about 5 miles of the route, because it's about 15 miles in total, it's pretty much underneath the kind of North Circular. And when you're actually on the trail, it's so lush. There's so much, wonderful kind of the vegetation in the green, and, you can really switch off. But actually, all of the times that I'm driving on that road, I have the opposite effect, where I go, actually, I know that just beneath here is like an oasis of trail running, So it kind of gives me that sort of opposite feeling. But yeah, that's when we started to introduce that to friends and local runners, no one seemed to know much about it. But it's quite a special route.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. And then you've got the London Greenways Challenge. So this is a very different kind of event. This is a year-long event for 2022, and it consists of a series of 12 routes that participants can run whenever they want, though you're releasing them sort of once a month. Is that right?
Exactly. When we first came up with the idea, Ed, it was it was sort of very much to share that it didn't really matter in which kind of corner of London you're in. There were these kind of unique sets of trails that already exist. For the most part, Ed, they're very well signposted. They're reasonably well maintained by the various sort of local councils. And then when you start to kind of familiarise yourself with them, you can kind of realise that, so for example, one of the ones we've already had is called the Dulwich Valley, which kind of goes from northwest London and through some absolutely fantastic like woodland and sort of remote areas, and then as it gets closer to London, it sort of ends at the top of Hampstead Heath. And when you're in Hampstead Heath, you sort of realise that you're actually on a couple of other trail areas, and we both know how wonderful Hampstead Heath is to sort of run in. So I really love that idea that after a period of time, people might be able to think, okay, well, I could perhaps join one trail up with another, and to go back to the centre of the universe. And maybe they start to realise that there are ways that you can kind of create this wonderful flow in and out of London, primarily through parks and forests and trails. So you can do it either as a 12 route challenge, or you can do them individually, Ed. So what we do is we kind of create a kind of, you call it like a virtual pack. And in that virtual pack, it's got all of the information that you would need to be able to help you find, how you get to the start, how you best use public transport. Importantly, where you'll find a good coffee shop, get a nice coffee in before you run, where there may be some helpful facilities, toilets, etc. And a GPX that you could potentially use on your phone, or maybe if you've kind of got a sports watch. And then, once you've completed the run any time, then on our website, there's a sort of verification form, so you can put in there, how you felt the run was, what was good. And obviously a lot of the feedback we've received through the form, we've been able to take and add it back into the virtual pack. So obviously people that are doing it more recently are benefiting from some kind of wonderful insight from other runners. And everyone that finishes gets a nice kind of recyclable medal from the guys from Zero Waste.
Nice.
And each one, Ed, is a puzzle piece. So if you do all 12, they fit together nicely as a 12-piece puzzle.
That's awesome. You mentioned that COVID saw this sort of rise in virtual events like this. Are you sort of finding that now that things are more or less sort of back to normal for mass participation events, are you finding there's still a desire for these kind of virtual events?
It's a really great question. So two things sort of happened, Ed. One is, as sort of mentioned before, I think globally there's a huge explosion in not only running but kind of endurance in all its forms. You'll seeing people on wonderfully long cycle rides or epic swims, or combining multi-sports, and that of course that's absolutely fabulous. But there's a lot of companies now out there all in that same space, and I think once the virtual, once you're able to go back to real events, there's a lot of choice out there, but it also means that some are becoming quite successful and some are kind of struggling to stay afloat, actually. And a lot of smaller companies have already bitten the dust, which has been a real shame. So the whole scene probably needs to find its sort of position again. And I think for Camino, the best thing that we can do is to sort of stay true to our roots and keep it entry level and keep it local, and it works for us.
Yeah, well, it's an awesome idea, and I definitely need to sign up and try some of them out myself.
We'd love to see you, Ed.
Absolutely. Talking of COVID, which you brought up, one of the things, as I said, that I really recall about those early months of lockdown was sort of seeing Camino everywhere and seeing yourselves everywhere. And I think that's got a lot to do with just the sheer number of FKTs that you were setting, which I'd love to discuss. I encourage anyone listening to head to fastestknowntime.com and look up David's records. I didn't count them because there's literally too many. It must be over 100, right? Or close to it.
Yeah, it's 108, I think, Ed.
Oh my goodness. There was that huge wave of FKTs, particularly that first year of COVID, and it looks like at times you were sort of running one a week. Obviously, that was a kind of dark period of history in many ways, but there were sort of silver linings associated with it in terms of, people considering what was important to them and going on these sort of more explorative solo adventures. Is that a time that you look back on fondly in some ways?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I will definitely cherish, that side of it, Ed, forever, because it was a very unique time, wasn't it? I mean, I know for lots of people and sort of friends of mine, it was very tough, So I did often find it difficult, and obviously anything that was kind of appearing on Strava or being broadcast about it, it wasn't that side of it that I particularly liked. What, as you know, I mean, one of the challenges in the COVID period was, if you lived in a city like London, was that if you went, to your local kind of coffee shop, you could be stood in a queue of 30 people to get your coffee, whereas if you got in your car and you went somewhere remote to run a trail, some people didn't like it, I understood, but I felt personally a lot more comfortable being on my own, running a FKT route in the middle of nowhere than I did being somebody else that was, in large groups of people in that particular period. So, it became a real kind of discovery of kind of solace, sort of that sort of championing of. I learned so much. I sort of really threw myself into the history of which London, some of these routes were, routes that were, put on the map by monks and, wonderful kind of religious history and battles. And in that early period, Ed, I found so many of them in or very close to London. Many of them were, very accessible in terms of distance. A lot of those that you'll find on that website are, say, 8-10 kilometres to 10 miles. I think the history of the fastest known time initially was about the really epic routes that exist, and in London we have the Capital Ring, which is probably like one of the blue ribboned events, and obviously around the UK we have the Land's End to John O'Groats and famous routes like the Pennine Way and the Cotswolds. But I loved finding out about the Chess Valley, which is another one in your neck of the woods. And there's quite a lot that exist. Old railway routes up in the Nicky line, ones around St Albans and Hertfordshire, and there's a lot actually in that Kent area we already mentioned, just sort of the other side of the M25. So it was a real joyful period actually. And Ed, and I've been doing far less for lots of different reasons recently, but I'll always look back fondly.
Well, it's obviously FKTs are obviously something you still enjoy. It's May now when we're recording this, and you've got 7 FKTs to your name in 2022 so far. There's one in particular from years ago that is really close to my heart, and it's the London Loop. For listeners who don't know, the Loop in London Loop stands for London Outer Orbital Path. This is a 150-mile trail that circumnavigates the edge of Greater London, starting in Erith in the east, just south of the river, which is an amazing landscape, and it sort of winds its way clockwise all the way back to Rainham, just across the river on the other shore. You ran this in July 2020. That must have been quite the experience to run.
Yeah, that was... Again, it was, how we were in lockdown, then out of lockdown, and then in lockdown again. So I had been doing a virtual challenge. There's a great company called End to End who do a lot of these great virtual events, which are good for companies and charity fundraising. And their first one they ever did was a virtual run from Land's End to John O'Groats. So basically you had 850 miles to cover locally, and you would see yourself progressing up this kind of virtual map. And I found myself in a bit of a tussle with a couple of other people to try and be the first person to complete this virtual event. And so it got me thinking, Ed, that as I wasn't winning, that I needed to up the stakes a little bit and actually try and get some big miles in quickly. So having done some of those shorter distance FKTs that I mentioned, I decided to do my homework and look to see if there was sort of a 100+ mile one that I could do, in a sort of few weeks after the investigation. And I found the London Loop. it was something that I'd never heard of before. What I was totally amazed about, Ed, is that, you know, if anybody goes to look for the London Loop online, you will see that it's perfectly split into 13 sections, and it's on the website, which is fabulously maintained by you know, London. I think it's on the Transport for London website. You know, it gives you really great information as to how you could maybe do one of the sections as a day trip. You know, how you get out of London and how you would get onto the route. So you know, all of the information was there. It sort of had these 13 sections. So what I did, Ed, was I put out a request on a few social channels to, you know, to ultra runners, to say, you know, would anybody be keen to come and run a few legs with me? And the response was absolutely incredible. You know, I really was, still am totally blown away by how many people got in touch. I mean, and not only wanting to do it, but also recognised some of the complexities of, you know, when I would actually be at that section. You know, because obviously the nighttime stages were, you know, required a bit more sort of care and attention in terms of the kind of crew.
I was going to say, I mean, you know, part of the reason I bring it up is it's a trail that's very close to my heart. Again, not a trail that's very well known, but I think for Londoners, I really think it should be. I think it should be a national trail or something, because it's just an awesome way to explore the city. I grew up, as I mentioned, sort of right on the London border in Hertfordshire, and when I first got into running, you know, as is so often the case, I found all these new places right on my childhood doorstep that I just never knew existed. And one of these was Harrow Weald Common, which the London Loop sort of passes straight through. Although thinking about it now, I guess that was kind of the middle of the night for you, right? Around mile 80 or thereabouts. Maybe it was evening.
It was absolutely plumb in the middle of the night.
Right.
And so an extraordinary thing happened at that exact place. So I was actually running with Alison again, and my really dear friend Stephen, and we, you know, pitch black, and suddenly this voice came out of nowhere, and it was a chap who was in the British Army. Right. Who had only recently moved, because in that part of the world that you grew up in, there were, I don't know if there still are, some, you know, some army bases.
Yes, there's a sort of RAF complex.
Exactly.
As well.
Yeah, and this chap had seen, you know, one of the requests that I'd put out there, and had been tracking us on the live tracker, and said, you know, did we mind if he did, you know, a few miles with us? And thankfully for us, that was actually quite a because there's a sort of series of like woodland.
Yeah, it's very difficult to navigate in places.
Oh, it was impossible. So we just took a back seat and let this guy with his, you know, he had a handheld torch. Oh, wow. I think he had a bag of Mentos, or maybe Werther's Original, which was great. And you know, we took our time, and he guided us through the woods, you know, and that actually happened about 2 or 3 times throughout that entire London Loop trip, that, you know, local people would come out just at magical times, and you know, knew the area extremely well. You know, we didn't, and it was a joy to be kind of guided by locals on those different sections. When we got, I have to say, for listeners, like, that entire route is magical. Like, any section's great, except there's a section right near the end in Essex, where it started to go completely off grid and go through an area of farmland where clearly they didn't want you to be on.
Oh, wow.
And we got chased off this farm by this very angry farmer. And when we got to the edge of his farm, we could see that the London Loop sign had been like hacked off.
Oh my goodness!
and like almost half buried.
Wow.
But other than that,
what a way! That's a very London way to finish, right? To be yelled at
exactly.
by a stranger.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Brilliant.
My partner and I have been walking it, and I've been running it in sections, and I've only got as far as sort of Croydon Way, but I'm really looking forward to that's return to the east, because the landscape there, that kind of flat landscape is really awesome.
You've already mentioned, haven't you, the actual start is beautiful, the bit round Erith and
it's incredible.
That part of the wildness of the Thames, and you can see you see the M25 and the
Dartford crossing
and the bridge,
yeah.
The Dartford crossing, of course, and all of that section. My family are from the Croydon, Old Coulsdon area, and I had a phone call actually the night before I started from my dad, and he was retelling me some wonderful stories of where he grew up and playing in these areas that were basically created by German bombs, these great big craters, and I was saying to him, this is amazing. Like when I get to that section of the loop, I might take a little detour and see if I can see.
Yeah.
But when we got there, I just had absolutely no idea that I was anywhere near sort of Croydon. You're so well protected and covered on this route.
Yeah.
You do really feel like you're in the middle of nowhere and not near the city, and that is pretty spectacular.
Yeah. Well, I think in a way you've cut to the core of it there. It's the route passes through this no man's land between London proper and the countryside proper, and it never quite commits to either of them. But in doing that, it feels like you're discovering a whole sort of hidden corridor of amazing places that are really under-celebrated. It's an epic trail. It's 150 miles long. In classic fashion, you've pointed to all the people who helped you do it, and you haven't talked about how incredible it is that you ran 150 miles. Your record of, I believe, 34 hours and 23 minutes remains uncontested. Any plans to revisit that someday? Maybe run it counterclockwise? So,
tantalisingly, Ed, there is another similar distance, which is sort of the closest that you can follow the M25 with not being on the M25. So that's quite tempting, as also is a record that's held by a wonderful chap called Richard McChesney. I don't know if you know Richard. He'd be a great guest for your podcast. So
great surname.
He's one of the world's best fast walkers, and he holds the record for travelling to all of the London tube stops in one go.
Wow.
Without a break, on foot.
Wow.
So this is, and obviously some of the, it's very intricate in itself to try and map out, how you don't sort of double back on yourself and stay to the stick rules. And I think the record is 5 days. I think there's something like, I guess the challenge now, Ed, is that they're just opening up a new line, aren't they, with the Elizabeth line?
Get it in now.
But I was thinking about having a crack at that in the summer, actually.
Yeah, that would be incredible. I'm just thinking about John Kelly, who's out on the Wainwrights at the moment.
That's
that is
amazing,
a very London version of the Wainwrights.
Yeah, we have to come up with another Smog Graham type name, won't we? Our own Wainwright.
Yeah. There's a great book I can't remember, I've got it on my shelf somewhere. There's a guy who walked the M25, and I think he did it sort of on the sort of grass verge.
Okay.
Which is very much, I think, not allowed, and it wouldn't probably be very fun, but he's written an amazing book about it. I'll send you a title for it. I can't remember it right now.
I'd love to read that. There's also another thing that I absolutely love, which is this Right to Rome explosion that's taking place at the moment, and this whole idea about trespass and where we're allowed to go and not allowed to go. And obviously personally believe it's a crime, the amount of the lack of access that we have, and especially obviously the different rules in England, say, to Scotland, where you're not even allowed to kind of respectfully wild camp like you can there. So I think with what's going on in that space, Ed, and those trends, again, hopefully that is going to be exciting in terms of unlocking some of the gems that may exist out there that will be able to kind of connect us, as you've already pointed out, between the city and all of the epic landscape that exists just outside of the city.
Yeah, or even just alongside us. You glimpse places from the train window sometimes, and you wonder, is that a place you can go, or is that just someone's land that they've sealed off? It's funny, there's a strange dichotomy between, trail running. We're running on trails. Trails are lines of dirt, and so having a very narrow corridor through which you're allowed to move is quite conducive to trail running, because all you need is that narrow corridor. But when you actually think about it, a route like the London Loop, I mean, how much of that route passes straight between land that either side of you're not allowed to even step on? It's
exactly,
yeah, it's food for thought.
Tantalizing, isn't it?
Yeah. David, I just want to thank you so much for giving me your time. It's been a real pleasure to reconnect and to chat with you. I just have one more question, which is a question I'm trying to ask everyone on this podcast. You've run in some amazing places around the world, and you've explored probably more of London in terms of its green spaces than just about anyone I can think of. I was thinking earlier, I'd love to see your Strava heat map. I bet it's absolutely plastered. Is there sort of one route or location that you could sort of point to if someone were to ask you, what's your favourite place to run?
Well, that is a wonderful question, isn't it? I mean, I guess the one of the challenges is that I personally, Ed, have lived next to one of our major parks, Victoria Park, for a huge part of my running life and my adult running life, and I guess myself and I'm a member of the local running club. There's the most glorious love-hate relationship when you've got something so beautiful and precious on your doorstep. It is somewhere that I it's a real, it's a place that I love to run. But I guess I've done many a loop round that park, and so there's nothing more pleasurable than kind of getting outside of this area and going somewhere different. I've had this route planned idea. So there's actually a route called the Games Way,
right,
that was created to kind of commemorate the 2012 Olympics, and it goes from where effectively I live, the kind of the Olympics Park Stadium, and it goes all the way down to the south coast where the sailing took place in Weymouth.
Oh, wow.
And it actually connects three of the most iconic South UK trails. So I think it's 135 miles. But I don't think anyone's ever done it.
Yeah,
so,
I have to say I've never heard of it, and it sounds like a amazing route.
Yeah, so I think it would be a real wonderful thing to kind of maybe do it with a bit of kind of community spirit.
Yeah.
And put it out there and get a group of us together, and maybe fast pack it, take some sleeping, take some bivvy, sit under the stars,
baked beans,
brew up a nice coffee, take some baked beans, fueled by baked beans,
and some mushrooms. You could find us some mushrooms.
we could go on like an FKT foraging route. So in a couple of months' time, Ed, let's find the summer sun and let's do it. Yeah,
absolutely. I bought myself a fast packing bag in January, so I've got no excuse.
Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, David.
Thank you, Ed. It's been a real pleasure, buddy.
What a guy, DaznBone. Such a pleasure to talk to him and get to know some of the story of Camino Ultra. I actually ended up jumping into the Lee Valley 50k myself back in June, and I was so glad I did. The route ran through the literal backwaters of suburbia. It was stunning, scenic, and heading into the heart of Hackney was just a really different, unique way to finish an ultramarathon. Just like he always is, David was super positive and supportive on the day, despite having just completed the South Downs Way 100 himself the previous weekend. He and Darren are all about community and putting on great, welcoming events, and it really showed. There were so many people completing their first ultramarathon, and the atmosphere was just super positive and fun. If you want to find out more, you can find Camino on Instagram at Camino_Ultra, or you can head to CaminoUltra.com. Next week, I'm super excited to bring you a chat I had with Richard McDowell, aka the Turbo Ferret. Richard is a blisteringly fast road runner who in recent years has made a bit of a name for himself in the trail running scene, not least by running the fastest ever trail 100-miler on British soil.
I had a chat with Robbie Britton actually, and he was saying, well, it's not about your aerobic limit. It's not that physical, but not like lactate threshold. That's totally irrelevant. It's keeping running at a rate where you can keep digesting, keep your GI system on track. So the idea was to run slowly enough so I could keep my stomach online.
That's next week. Hope to see you there. But otherwise, that's me, Ed Scott, signing out. And I hope you enjoy this bonus clip from my chat with the lovely DaznBone, in which you'll get a peek behind the curtain into the perils of recording remotely and find out a bit more about the unusual context in which David and I first met.
For lots of different reasons recently, but yeah, I'll always look back fondly.
I apologise, the phone is ringing. Just give me one sec. All right, back in the room. Sorry, it's like Piccadilly Circus here. Yeah,
so Ed,
I was.
Ed, so you and I, we actually met on a fastest known time, didn't we?
Yes, we did. The Smog Graham. Yeah,
the Smog Graham. I mean, that in itself.
It doesn't get more epic in London. In London FKT terms, it does not get more epic than that.
So that was our friend Alison Walker.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have Alison on to talk about that actually. So fingers crossed there'll be an episode. It's a stunning, absolutely stunning achievement, and it was amazing, just an amazing thing to be a very small part of. Just to feel like you were really out there with it.
Again, so if any of your listeners are perhaps not familiar, there are, especially in the UK, there are kind of several routes that are in existence, which are kind of cherished as being some of the toughest fell and trail routes. And one's called the Bob Graham Round, which is a kind of a 60-mile route in the Lake District where you have to do some of the toughest climbs, all inside of a 24-hour period. And then I think it was one of the editors of Runner's World, Rick.
Yeah, that's right.
That decided to come up with a London version, and rather than Bob, called it Smog.
Yeah. So it hits the highest point in every London borough, of which there are 32. And I think it's on the order of a sort of 180 miles long. I might be wrong on that.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's 180 miles, yeah.
And amazingly, and a testament to the green spaces that you've talked about, it's about 50% off-road, which for a city like London, you would not necessarily assume that was possible, but it really takes advantage of, particularly in the outer boroughs, all the green spaces that are available. And this was Alison Walker, for listeners who don't know, who set that record, which, I mean, no one had ever done it before, so it was a guaranteed FKT, and I'd be surprised if anyone tries it again because it was a brutal run. Yeah,
no, but as you said, it really does. Again, if any of your listeners go to the fastestknowntime.com website, or you can go and have a look at these routes, and even if you decide to do a relatively small chunk of the Smog Graham Round, you'll probably find some wonderful new routes and new trails.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a pretty wonderful route.